Every year, a stranger transferred $77,777 to me on my birthday. This went on for 15 years, and I never knew who the sender was. But this year, instead of the usual transfer, $27 million arrived with one phrase: "We need to meet urgently." Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Donovan, and for 34 years I built my life on a foundation I never fully understood. I grew up in Portland with my mother, Susan, a hospital administrator who raised me alone after my father left when I was 2. We were not rich. We were not poor. We were ordinary, the kind of ordinary that makes you grateful and restless at the same time. Everything changed the year I turned 20. On my birthday, a wire transfer appeared in my new bank account, $77,777. No name attached, no note beyond a single reference line. For Claire every year. I assumed it was a clerical error. I called the bank. They confirmed the transfer was legitimate, traced through an attorney's trust account, but the source was sealed by a confidentiality agreement. My mother, when I asked her, went pale and changed the subject. That was the first time I understood that some doors in my life were locked on purpose. The money kept coming. Every year on the same date, the same impossible number, $77,777. I built a life around it without ever depending on it. I finished my degree in architecture, started my own small firm in Seattle, married a man named Dean, who I later divorced amicably, and raised my daughter Mia, mostly on my own. The money sat in a separate account I rarely touched, growing with modest interest, a strange inheritance from a ghost. I used to ask myself, late at night, who would do this for 15 years and never once ask for anything back? Was it guilt? Was it love? Was it control disguised as generosity? I told myself it didn't matter. I had a good life. I had Mia. I had work I loved. Why disturb a gift horse that never once made demands? But gifts that ask nothing eventually ask everything. I just didn't know that yet. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 years before everything broke open. My mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and in her more lucid moments, she began saying things that didn't fit the woman I knew. "You should have been raised differently," she told me once, gripping my hand so hard it left marks. "I should never have let them decide." "Decide what?" I asked. She only shook her head and wept. Around the same time, my cousin Renata, my mother's sister's daughter, a woman I'd always found cold but tolerated for family's sake, started showing up at family gatherings with a strange, proprietary interest in my finances. She asked about my firm's revenue. She asked, too casually, whether I'd ever had my finances looked at professionally, whether I trusted my accountant, whether I'd ever considered that some of my income might be complicated. I brushed it off as nosiness. Renata had always been nosy. Then there was my Uncle Philip, my mother's older brother, a man who'd made a fortune in commercial real estate and who treated family events like board meetings. He'd corner me at Thanksgiving and ask pointed questions about my mother's health, about her assets, about whether she'd updated her will. I found it tasteless, but not at the time sinister. Looking back, I can see now how the pieces were already arranged on the board before I ever knew a game was being played. The mysterious money, my mother's guilt, Renata's curiosity, Philip's calculated interest, all of it orbiting around something none of them would name. That brings me to the year everything broke. I was 35. My birthday fell on a Tuesday, and I was in my office reviewing blueprints for a client's lake house when my phone buzzed with the banking app notification. I expected the familiar number, $77,777, the figure that had become almost comforting in its consistency, a strange anniversary I'd stopped questioning. Instead, the screen showed $27 million. I stared at it for nearly a full minute, certain it was a glitch. I refreshed the app 3 times. The number didn't change. My hands were shaking when I opened the transaction details, and that's when I saw the message attached to the wire. 4 words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my own life. We need to meet urgently. No signature, no explanation, just those words, sitting beneath a number large enough to swallow my entire understanding of who I was and where I came from. I sat in my office chair, the blueprints forgotten on my desk, my coffee going cold beside me, and I asked myself the question that would define the next several months of my life. After 15 years of silence, why now? And why so much? I didn't know yet that the answer involved a dying woman's secret, a family fortune built on a decision made before I was born, and 3 people who had spent over a decade quietly preparing for the day I would finally ask the right question. Right. But sitting there, staring at that impossible number, I felt something I hadn't felt in 15 years of unexplained birthday gifts. Real fear. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through 15 years of bank statements, trying to find a pattern I'd never bothered to look for before. 15 transfers of $77,777. That was $1,166,655 over 15 years. Money I had absorbed into my life like weather, never asking why it fell. Now there was $27 million sitting in an account I barely recognized as mine, and 4 words that read less like a gift and more like a summons. I called my mother first. It was nearly midnight, but dementia had scrambled her sense of time long before mine, and she answered on the second ring, her voice thin and unsteady. "Mom," I said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Who has been sending me money?" There was a long silence, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, very quietly, "Ask Philip. Ask him about your father's company." And then she hung up. Or the call ended, or she simply forgot she was holding the phone. I never knew with her anymore. Your father's company. My father, Richard Donovan, who left when I was 2 and died, according to family lore, in a car accident in Arizona when I was 9. I had no memory of him. My mother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a clipped bitterness that discouraged questions. I had always assumed he left us with nothing. Apparently, I had assumed wrong. The next morning, I called my attorney, a careful, methodical woman named Priya Shah, who had handled my divorce and my firm's contracts for years. I told her everything. The 15 years of mysterious deposits, the $27 million, the message, my mother's cryptic instruction. Priya was quiet for a long moment before she said what I needed to hear. "Claire, before you do anything else, you need to find out where this money actually came from. If it's tied to an estate, a business, or a trust, accepting it without understanding the structure could expose you legally. You could be liable for taxes you don't know about. You could be stepping into a dispute that isn't yours to inherit." That single sentence terrified me more than the number itself. I wasn't just inheriting money. I might be inheriting a war. I thought about Renata's strange questions over the years, about whether my income was complicated. I thought about Philip's interest in my mother's will, his casual probing about her assets. Neither of them, I now realized, had been making conversation. They had been gathering information, watching me, waiting to see if I understood what I held. That afternoon, I drove to my mother's care facility outside Portland. The lake house blueprints abandoned on my desk, my assistant fielding calls I had no patience for. My mother was having a good day, lucid enough to recognize me, frightened enough to grip my wrist the moment I sat down. "You found out," she said. It wasn't a question. "Found out what, Mom? Please, I need you to tell me everything you can remember." What she told me, in fragments interrupted by confusion and tears, was this. My father, Richard, hadn't died penniless. He'd built a logistics company in Phoenix with his brother, my Uncle Philip, and when he died, his 40% stake should have passed to me, his only child. Instead, Philip and my mother's sister, Renata's mother, had quietly restructured the company's ownership in the years after his death, using legal mechanisms my mother only half understood, mechanisms that pushed my inheritance into a dormant trust controlled by Philip. The $77,777 yearly transfers, she said, were Philip's idea. A guilty conscience payment, small enough never to draw attention, designed to keep me comfortable and incurious, while the company itself, now worth tens of millions, stayed entirely in his hands. I sat there in the sterile visiting room, the smell of antiseptic and instant coffee in the air, and felt something shift permanently inside me. 15 years of birthday transfers weren't generosity. They were hush money, dressed up as love, paid by a man who had spent over a decade making sure I never asked the question I was finally asking now. But why send $27 million now? Why break the pattern after 15 years of careful, deliberate restraint? I didn't get my answer that day, but driving home through the gray Oregon rain, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I would not simply accept this money and disappear back into my comfortable life. I would find out exactly what my father's company was worth, exactly what had been taken from me, and exactly what Philip wanted in return for finally, after 15 years, breaking his silence. That night, I opened a blank document on my laptop and started writing down everything I knew. Names, dates, numbers, every strange comment Renata and Philip had made over the years. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Fear was still sitting heavy in my chest, but underneath it, for the first time since that notification had appeared on my phone, I felt something steadier. Resolve. I would not walk into whatever meeting they wanted blind. I would walk in prepared. The first thing I did was hire a forensic accountant. Priya recommended a man named Walter Greaves, a quiet, precise man in his 60s who had spent 3 decades untangling family business disputes for estate attorneys across the Pacific Northwest. I gave him everything. The 15 years of transfer records, my father's name, the name of the company my mother remembered, Donovan Hale Logistics, and the little I knew about Philip's role in it. It took Walter 11 days to come back with something concrete, 11 days during which I told no one, not Renata, not Philip, not even Mia, though she noticed I was distracted and asked more than once if I was all right. I told her work was stressful. It wasn't entirely a lie. What Walter found confirmed my worst fear and exceeded it. Donovan Hale Logistics, founded by my father and Philip in the late 1980s, had grown into a regional freight and warehousing company, now valued, by Walter's conservative estimate, at just over $96 million. After my father's death, ownership records showed a series of transfers. My father's original 40% stake reorganized through two intermediate holding companies before settling entirely under Philip's control. The paper trail was sloppy in places, the kind of sloppy that suggested arrogance rather than caution. Whoever did this hadn't expected anyone to look. There was a probate filing, too, one my mother had apparently signed on my behalf when I was still a minor, a guardian's waiver relinquishing any claim to my father's business interests in exchange for ongoing financial support for the minor child. That clause was the legal skeleton holding up 15 years of $77,777 birthday transfers. It wasn't a gift. It was a settlement my mother had agreed to without my consent, without my knowledge, while I was still a child too young to understand what was being signed away in my name. Walter's blunt assessment was sobering. On paper, Claire, this waiver might hold up. Guardians sign these things all the time, and courts are reluctant to unwind them decades later. But if we can show the waiver was procured through undue influence, or that your mother wasn't of sound capacity when key amendments were made, and there were amendments, 3 of them, the last one only 6 years ago, you may have grounds to challenge it. 6 years ago. My mother's dementia diagnosis came 4 years ago. If an amendment had been signed 2 years before that, while her mental state was already declining, it strengthened my case considerably. I felt something cold and clarifying settle into my chest. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation over coffee. This was going to be a legal fight, and I needed to start treating it like one. I scheduled a follow-up consultation with Priya the same week Walter delivered his findings. We talked through options for nearly 3 hours. Formal demand letters, a possible probate court challenge, the question of whether to engage law enforcement given the apparent forgery risk around the later amendment. Priya was cautious, as always. Once you send a formal letter, Claire, you lose the element of surprise. They'll know you know. There's no undoing that. I thought about the $27 million sitting in my account and the 4 words attached to it. We need to meet urgently. Whatever Philip's plan was, it had clearly been set in motion before I'd done any of this digging, which meant something else had triggered it. Something on his end, not mine. That answer came 2 days later, and it came from an unexpected source. Renata. She called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. None of her usual cool detachment. Claire, I need to talk to you, not on the phone. Can we meet? I agreed, more out of curiosity than trust, and we met the following afternoon at a coffee shop in the Pearl District neutral ground, public enough that I felt safe. Renata looked thinner than I remembered, her hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from. Philip is selling the company, she said without preamble. There's a buyer, a private equity group out of Dallas. The deal closes in 6 weeks. He sent you that money because once the sale finalizes, your claim becomes almost impossible to enforce. The assets convert to cash and scatter across new entities. He's not trying to make peace with you, Claire. He's trying to buy your silence one last time, permanently, before the window closes. I sat there with my coffee going cold, the same way it had the morning the $27 million appeared, and I understood finally what I was actually looking at. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't even guilt anymore. This was a closing trade, and I was the loose end Philip needed tied off before his payday cleared. The point of no return had arrived, and I hadn't even noticed crossing it. I looked at Renata, searching her face for the angle I assumed she had to be playing. Why are you telling me this? Her answer chilled me more than anything Walter had found in the paperwork. Because my mother signed those same waivers when she was sick, for a different reason, a different fight, years before yours. and I watched what it did to her, and I never said anything. I'm not doing that again. I had 6 weeks, and now, for the first time, I had an ally I never expected. 6 weeks was not much time to unwind 15 years of careful concealment, but it was enough if I moved fast and moved smart. The first official step was a formal demand letter, drafted by Priya and reviewed twice by Walter for accuracy, sent by certified mail to Philip's attorney and separately to the private equity group preparing to acquire Donovan Hale Logistics. The letter laid out, in clinical legal language, my claim to a 40% ownership interest improperly diverted through a guardian's waiver signed under questionable capacity conditions, and it requested an immediate hold on the pending transaction until the matter could be resolved. I sent it on a Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Philip called me directly for the first time in over a year. Claire. His voice was warm, practiced, the voice of a man who had spent decades smoothing over difficult conversations in boardrooms. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Let's not involve lawyers in a family matter. Come to the house Saturday. We'll sort this out properly, the way your father would have wanted. I almost laughed at the irony of him invoking my father, a man whose legacy he had spent 15 years quietly dismantling. I told him I would attend, but that Priya would be present as well. The silence on the other end told me he hadn't expected that. The PE firm's response came Thursday, more measured but no less significant. Their counsel acknowledged receipt of my letter and confirmed that, pending review, the closing timeline might require adjustment. Philip would know this within hours if he didn't already. The pressure I had applied was working, and that meant the pressure would now come back at me, harder. It arrived Friday evening, the night before our scheduled meeting. I was at home, helping Mia with a school project, when my doorbell rang. It was Renata, pale and shaking, telling me Philip had called her, furious, accusing her of leaking information, threatening to cut her family's stipend entirely, and to pursue legal action against her for breach of a confidentiality agreement she'd apparently signed years earlier regarding the company's finances. He said if either of us pushes this, he'll bury you in litigation until the money runs out before the case ever sees a judge, she told me. He said he has people who can make your professional life difficult, Claire. Clients, contracts. He implied it without saying it directly, but I understood him perfectly. I felt the threat land exactly where it was meant to, in my work, the one part of my life I had built entirely myself, with no inherited money behind it. My firm depended on relationships, referrals, reputation. A man with Philip's resources and connections could do real damage if he wanted to. I called Priya immediately. Her advice was steady, unhurried in a way that helped me breathe. Document everything Renata just told you, in writing today while it's fresh. Threats like this, especially ones implying retaliation against your business, only strengthen your position if this goes to court. He's not negotiating from strength, Claire. He's negotiating from panic. Strong men in strong positions don't threaten people days before a scheduled meeting. They just show up. That reframing helped more than I expected. I went into Saturday's meeting at Philip's house, a sprawling property outside Lake Oswego that I had visited perhaps 4 times in my entire life. Not as a frightened relative, but as a woman who understood finally exactly what was at stake and exactly what leverage she held. The meeting itself was tense but contained. Philip tried charm first, reminiscing about my father, producing old photographs I'd never seen, clearly hoping sentiment would soften my resolve. When that failed, he shifted to thinly veiled warnings about the cost and duration of litigation. the toll it would take on my mother's already fragile health if she were called to testify, the damage prolonged legal conflict could do to family relationships that, he insisted, still mattered to him. I let Priya handle most of the legal back and forth, but at the end, I spoke directly to him. You sent me $27 million and asked to meet urgently. I think we both know that wasn't generosity. That was the price you were willing to pay to make me disappear quietly before your sale closed. I'm not disappearing, Philip. And I'm not taking that money as a settlement either, not until I understand exactly what I'm actually owed. He didn't respond right away. For the first time in my life, I watched genuine uncertainty cross his face, the practiced warmth slipping for just a moment before he composed himself again. We left without an agreement, the PE deal's timeline still hanging in uncertain limbo, Philip's threat still echoing faintly behind us. I drove Renata home afterward, both of us quiet, drained in the particular way that comes after sustained adrenaline. When I got back to my own house that night, I told Mia I needed a few quiet days, and I meant it. I turned off my phone notifications, declined 2 client calls I would normally have prioritized, and spent the following Tuesday and Wednesday simply walking along the waterfront with my dog, letting my mind go still after weeks of constant calculation. I had pushed back, and I had survived the pushback. Now I needed to be steady for whatever came next. The quiet didn't last as long as I wanted, but it lasted long enough to clear my head. By the following Monday, I was back at my office reviewing blueprints with something close to normal focus when Walter called with an update that shifted the ground again. The PE firm's legal team had requested a formal meeting with both parties, myself and Philip, to assess the validity of my claim before deciding whether to proceed with, delay, or restructure the acquisition. It was, Walter said, an unusually direct move for a corporate buyer, evidence that my demand letter had introduced real risk into their due diligence. Before that meeting could happen, though, Philip tried a different approach entirely. He stopped threatening and started offering. The call came from his attorney this time, a smooth-voiced man named Gregory Aldis, proposing what he called a generous resolution, an immediate lump sum payment of $8 million on top of the $27 million already transferred, in exchange for my signing a binding release of all claims against Donovan Hale Logistics and a confidentiality agreement preventing me from ever discussing the matter publicly or with the acquiring firm. $35 million total to walk away and stay silent. It was, by any ordinary measure, an extraordinary sum. I sat with the offer for a full day before responding, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to be certain my refusal came from clarity rather than anger. Walter's valuation put my actual entitled share, accounting for 15 years of company growth and proper accounting of my father's original stake, somewhere between $34 and $41 million, not including any damages for the original improperly procured waiver. Their offer wasn't generous. It was a discount, dressed up to look like generosity, betting that the sheer size of the number would overwhelm my judgment. I declined through Priya, formally in writing, requesting instead full financial disclosure of the company's current valuation and ownership structure as a condition of any further negotiation. I felt strangely calm sending that letter, calmer than I'd felt in weeks. Whatever fear had driven me in those first nights after the $27 million appeared had settled into something more durable. Not fearlessness, exactly, but a kind of clear-eyed steadiness that came from finally understanding the full shape of what I was fighting. Philip and his team went quiet for nearly 2 weeks after that, a silence that Priya warned me not to mistake for retreat. "They're recalculating," she said. "Don't let the silence make you anxious. Use it." I used it to rebuild the parts of my life that had gone neglected during the chaos. Dinner with Mia without my phone on the table, a long overdue lunch with my closest friend from architecture school, Tasha, who I finally told the entire story to, start to finish, over too much wine on a Friday night. Tasha's reaction surprised me. She didn't gasp or marvel at the numbers. She simply asked, "What does winning actually look like to you, Claire? Not the money, the actual outcome you want." I thought about it longer than I expected to need. "I want it on record," I finally said, "that what they did was wrong. I want my mother's name cleared of having knowingly cheated me, and I want enough that Mia never has to wonder if she's safe, no matter what happens to my business." Tasha nodded slowly. "Then that's what you fight for. Not the headline number. That." That conversation mattered more than I realized at the time. It gave me language for what I actually wanted, separate from the dizzying scale of the figures being thrown around, and it reminded me I wasn't doing this alone. Renata, too, became an unexpected source of steadiness during those quiet weeks. We met for coffee twice more, and slowly, cautiously, something like real trust began forming between us, built on the shared experience of having been managed and minimized by the same family system for most of our adult lives. I also reconnected carefully with my mother's longtime physician, Dr. Annika Brennan, who agreed to provide a formal capacity assessment covering the period of the disputed trust amendment 6 years earlier. Her early review suggested what Walter had suspected: measurable cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia was likely already present, even if undiagnosed, at the time my mother signed that final amendment. It was the kind of medical evidence that could reshape the entire legal landscape of my claim. By the time Philip's team resurfaced with their next move, I was no longer the frightened, blindsided woman who had stared at her banking app in disbelief weeks earlier. I had allies. I had evidence. I had clarity about what I actually wanted. And I had, for the first time since this began, the cold, settled confidence of someone who understood she was no longer fighting from a position of confusion, but from one of growing strength. Philip's next move came disguised as reconciliation. He called me himself this time, his voice warm again, almost gentle, suggesting we meet without lawyers present. Just family, just to talk like we used to. I knew better than to agree without preparation, but I also recognized an opportunity. If he wanted to talk without his attorney shielding him, he might say something useful, something careless. I agreed, on the condition that the meeting happen at a public restaurant rather than his house, and that Renata join us as a witness, a condition he accepted with obvious reluctance. I spent the morning before the meeting going over the conversation in my head with Priya on the phone, walking through every likely angle Philip might take, every soft, reasonable-sounding argument he might use to make refusal feel unreasonable. "Remember," she told me before we hung up, "anything that sounds like concern for the family but conveniently benefits him. Financially isn't concern. It's strategy wearing a kinder face." I held on to that thought the entire drive to the restaurant, the rain streaking sideways across my windshield, my hands steadier on the wheel than I expected them to be. We met on a rainy Wednesday evening at a quiet Italian place near the river. Philip arrived first, looking older than he had at our last meeting, the practice charm slightly frayed at the edges. For the first 20 minutes, he was almost convincing, reminiscing again about my father, about childhood summers I barely remembered, expressing what sounded like genuine regret over how distant our family had become. I let him talk, watching, waiting. The mask slipped about halfway through dinner when he steered the conversation toward what he called protecting the family's legacy. He suggested that pursuing this through lawyers and courts would tear the family apart permanently, that my mother's declining health made her an unreliable and potentially embarrassing witness if this went to trial, that exposing the company's finances publicly could devalue the very inheritance I claimed to be fighting for. Each point was delivered gently, reasonably, the way a concerned relative might speak, except I had heard enough by then to recognize the structure underneath the warmth. This was manipulation, carefully calibrated, designed to make me feel that fighting for what was mine would somehow be the selfish, destructive choice. You're describing my mother's potential humiliation as a reason for me to give up what's legally hers to have passed to me, I said quietly. That's not protecting the family, Philip. That's protecting you. His expression shifted just slightly, the warmth cooling into something harder. You have no idea what I sacrificed building that company after your father died, Claire. I kept it alive. I kept paying you every single year when I didn't have to. Do you have any idea what 15 years of $77,777 actually cost me in opportunity, in reinvestment I couldn't make because I was protecting your interests? There it was, the resentment underneath the generosity finally exposed. He hadn't been protecting my interests. He'd been managing a liability year after year, and somewhere along the way had convinced himself that managing it generously made it something other than what it was: theft, paced out slowly enough to avoid ever looking like theft at all. I watched him say it, watched the self-pity in his voice, and felt something strange settle over me. Not anger exactly, but a kind of distant pity for a man so thoroughly convinced of his own righteousness that he could describe 15 years of concealment as sacrifice. Renata spoke up then, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in all our recent conversations. Philip, she's not asking for charity. She's asking for what Richard actually owned. You know that. You've known it for 15 years. Her voice didn't waver, even as Philip's eyes snapped toward her with something close to betrayal, as if her presence at the table had only ever been meant as a formality, not as an actual ally with an actual voice. His composure cracked fully then, just for a moment, anger flashing across his face before he caught himself and smoothed it back into something resembling calm. "This conversation is over," he said, standing abruptly, throwing cash on the table that more than covered the bill. "You'll regret pushing this, Claire. Both of you will." He left without another word, the restaurant door swinging shut behind him hard enough to draw glances from nearby tables. I sat there for a long moment afterward, my heart pounding, a tight knot of fear sitting low in my stomach. But underneath the fear, something else was growing, something steadier. He hadn't refuted anything. He hadn't denied the facts. He'd simply gotten angry when the manipulation failed, and that anger told me everything I needed to know about how thin his position actually was. Renata reached across the table and took my hand. "You didn't back down," she said. "I watched you not back down." We sat there a while longer after he left, neither of us in a hurry to move, the restaurant slowly emptying around us. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt something like genuine companionship in the middle of all the conflict. Proof that I wasn't navigating this alone. whatever Philip wanted me to believe. I realized, driving home through the rain that night, that the fear Philip had hoped to install in me had done the opposite of what he intended. It had clarified my resolve instead of weakening it. I called Priya from the car, relaying the entire conversation while it was still fresh, and her response was simple and certain. He just told you, without meaning to, exactly how much pressure it's going to take to win this. Use it. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, the small residual fear from the confrontation folding quietly into a deeper, more durable determination. Whatever came next, I was no longer the woman blindsided by an unexplained number on her banking app. I was a woman who understood exactly what she was fighting for and exactly who she was fighting against. The decisive moment came 5 weeks after the $27 million first appeared in a downtown Portland conference room belonging to the private equity firm's legal counsel Queen, neutral, formal ground, exactly the opposite of the manipulative intimacy Philip had tried to create at his house and at the restaurant. Walter's forensic accounting, Dr. Brennan's capacity assessment, and Priya's legal arguments had, over the preceding 2 weeks, persuaded the acquiring firm's attorneys that proceeding with the purchase, while my claim remained unresolved, exposed them to significant legal risk. They had insisted on this meeting as a condition of any further movement on the deal. I arrived early, almost 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and sat alone for a while in the building's ground floor cafe, watching the rain streak down the windows, rehearsing in my head everything I wanted to say and everything I knew I shouldn't. Priya joined me 10 minutes before we were due upstairs, and just having her steady presence beside me made the nervous flutter in my chest settle into something more manageable. Walter arrived last, carrying a thick binder of documentation under one arm, looking, as always, entirely unbothered by the stakes of the day. I arrived with Priya and Walter, both of them composed and professional in a way that steadied me. Philip arrived with Gregory Aldis, his attorney, looking tired in a way that made him seem smaller than I remembered him being just weeks earlier. Renata had not been invited by either side, but she waited in the lobby downstairs, having told me simply, "I want to be here when you walk out, whatever happens." The meeting began with the PE firm's lead counsel, a precise woman named Helena Cho, laying out the situation in stark terms. Walter's forensic report, combined with Dr. Brennan's capacity findings, had convinced her firm's risk assessment team that acquiring Donovan Hale Logistics without resolving my claim could expose them to years of costly litigation and a potentially voided transaction. They were prepared to walk away from the deal entirely unless ownership questions were settled in writing before closing. I watched something close to panic flicker across Philip's face for the first time in this entire ordeal. The deal he had engineered the $27 million payment to protect was now the very thing forcing his hand. It struck me, sitting there watching him absorb that realization, just how completely his own strategy had turned against him. The very payment meant to silence me had, through my refusal to simply accept it, become the evidence that proved exactly what he'd been trying to hide. Gregory tried to steer the conversation back towards settlement, offering a revised figure, $19 million more, on top of what had already been transferred, still framed as a final, generous resolution. But Priya, calm and unhurried, simply laid Walter's full valuation report on the table, along with Dr. Brennan's signed assessment and a timeline document showing the precise sequence of trust amendments alongside my mother's documented cognitive decline. "We're not negotiating from a hypothetical anymore," she said. We have a forensic accounting showing the company's true value, medical documentation establishing diminished capacity at the time of the disputed amendment, and a paper trail showing a pattern of concealment spanning 15 years. My client is prepared to litigate this fully, publicly, and for as long as necessary, unless we see a number and a structure that actually reflects what she's owed. Philip, for the first time since this began, looked genuinely unmoored. He started to speak, stopped, glanced at Gregory, who offered no rescue this time. "You don't understand what this would do," he finally said, his voice losing its practiced smoothness entirely. "If this becomes public, if there's litigation, the deal collapses. The company's value craters. Everyone loses, Claire. Everyone." "You decided that risk was acceptable 15 years ago," I said. "Every time you signed another transfer instead of telling me the truth. I'm not the one who created this situation, Philip. I'm just the one finally asking you to account for it." He didn't respond right away, and in that silence I noticed something I hadn't expected to notice. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of clarity, the sense that I was watching a man finally confront a version of himself he'd spent 15 years avoiding in the mirror. Helena Cho interjected then, her patience visibly thinning. "Mr. Donovan, my firm needs a resolution today, or we're terminating the acquisition agreement entirely. That's not a threat. That's simply where we are." Philip's face went pale. The deal, the entire reason he had pushed $27 million into my account in the first place, hoping to buy silence before the sale closed, was now collapsing precisely because of the silence breaking he had tried so hard to prevent. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. I watched Philip, a man who had spent 15 years controlling every variable in this story, finally run out of moves. His composure didn't crack loudly. It simply dissolved, quietly, into the resigned posture of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the version of events he'd maintained for so long was no longer his to control. Even Gregory, beside him, seemed to physically retreat an inch in his chair, as though distancing himself from a client he could no longer fully defend. "What do you want?" he finally asked me, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, it sounded less like a negotiation tactic and more like genuine surrender. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a cold, settled clarity. The truth, on record. My full ownership share, properly valued, with interest for the years it was withheld, and a public correction of the record regarding my mother's role, so her name is no longer attached to a decision she wasn't capable of fully understanding when she made it. Philip looked at Gregory, who simply nodded, recognizing, as I did, that there was no longer any version of this story where Philip controlled the outcome. The negotiations that followed took 11 more days to finalize, but the outcome was no longer in doubt after that conference room confrontation. Philip's options had narrowed to a single path, and every alternative, prolonged litigation, a collapsed acquisition, public exposure of 15 years of concealment, was worse for him than simply settling on terms that reflected the truth. The final agreement, signed in Priya's office on a gray Thursday morning, established my full 38% ownership stake in Donovan Hale Logistics, valued, with accumulated growth and interest for years withheld, at $42.3 million, separate from and in addition to the $27 million already transferred and the original 15 years of birthday payments. The PE acquisition proceeded, restructured to reflect my corrected ownership, my shares converting into a substantial cash settlement upon closing. Philip's remaining stake, once the controlling majority, shrank to a minority position. His control over the company's legacy and decision-making authority dissolved entirely in the process. But the money, significant as it was, mattered less to me than the second part of the agreement. A formal written correction acknowledging that my mother's original waiver had been signed without full understanding of the company's value, and that subsequent amendments, including the one 6 years earlier, were procured during a period of documented cognitive decline. It wasn't a criminal admission. Priya had warned me early on that pursuing fraud charges would be a long, uncertain road, one that might not survive my mother's deteriorating ability to testify. But it was, for my purposes, enough. My mother's name was cleared in writing of having knowingly participated in cheating her own daughter. Philip's defeat extended beyond the financial settlement. Within the company, his diminished ownership stake stripped him of the operational control he'd held for over 2 decades. The PE firm's new leadership team, uninterested in retaining someone whose conduct had nearly derailed their acquisition, negotiated his complete exit from any management role as a condition of finalizing the deal. He walked away from Donovan Hale Logistics, the company he and my father had built together, the company he'd spent 15 years quietly defending against my claim, with a fraction of the wealth and none of the control he'd once held. I learned, weeks later, through Renata, that his marriage had also begun unraveling under the strain of the public unwinding of his finances. His wife, blindsided by the scope of what he'd concealed for so long, had filed for separation almost immediately after the settlement became final. Renata herself, having stood beside me through the confrontation at the restaurant and the final negotiations, found her own relationship with Philip permanently severed, replaced by something far more valuable to her. A relationship with me built on honesty rather than family obligation. I sat with my mother the week after the settlement finalized, in her care facility outside Portland, holding her hand on one of her clearer days. I told her simply that everything had been resolved, that her name was cleared, that I understood now why she'd signed what she signed all those years ago, frightened and overwhelmed and trusting people who didn't deserve that trust. She squeezed my hand and said the clearest sentence she'd spoken to me in months. "I'm so sorry it took this long for someone to finally make it right." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. The fault had never been hers. It had belonged entirely to the people who exploited her vulnerability to protect their own interests. There was no dramatic confrontation scene, no shouted accusations in a courtroom, no satisfying public unmasking played out for an audience. The victory was quieter than that, and more complete. A settlement document, a corrected record, a company restructured to finally reflect the truth of who actually built it and who was owed its value. Philip didn't go to prison. He didn't lose everything down to his last dollar, but he lost the thing he'd spent 15 years protecting most carefully: control over the story and control over me. Walking out of Priya's office that final afternoon, the settlement papers signed and notarized, I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled since I was 20 years old and first saw an unexplained $77,777 appear in my account. 15 years of silence had finally been answered, completely on my terms. The months that followed the settlement reshaped my life in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even after everything that led there. I used a portion of the settlement to expand my architecture firm, hiring 2 additional senior designers, and finally taking on the kind of large-scale public projects I'd always wanted, but never had the capital to pursue. Within a year, my firm was awarded a contract to design a community arts center in downtown Portland, the kind of meaningful, visible work I'd dreamed about since architecture school. I set aside a significant portion of the remaining funds in a trust for Mia, structured carefully with Priya's guidance, to avoid ever replicating the kind of opaque, controlling arrangement that had shaped my own early life. Mia would know, always, exactly what she had and exactly where it came from. There would be no mysterious, unexplained transfers in her life, no 15 years of silence to untangle when she turned 35. My mother's care improved substantially once the financial pressure lifted. I moved her to a smaller, more attentive facility closer to my home, visiting several times a week. Her dementia continued its slow progression, but she spent her remaining lucid months at peace, free of the guilt that had clearly weighed on her for years before I understood why. She passed away 14 months after the settlement, peacefully, with me holding her hand, her name fully cleared. Renata and I grew genuinely close in the aftermath, our relationship built on honesty without manipulation, support without hidden agendas. She eventually pursued her own claim regarding her mother's earlier mistreatment within the family's business dealings, and I stood beside her through that process, a reversal of roles that felt earned. Philip's life, by contrast, continued its quiet unraveling. The divorce finalized within the year, further diminishing the wealth he had left after the Donovan Hale restructuring. Without operational control of the company or the consulting fees he'd quietly drawn for years, his financial position grew precarious. I heard that he'd attempted to start a smaller logistics consultancy that failed within 18 months, undermined by a reputation that had soured once the circumstances of his exit became known. I never sought out updates on him. The satisfaction I might once have imagined feeling at his downfall never fully materialized, replaced instead by something quieter, a sense of having closed a chapter that had shaped too much of my life without my consent. I needed the truth established, my mother's name cleared, and my own future secured. I had that, and it was enough. 2 years after the settlement, I stood in the lobby of the newly completed art center my firm had designed, and I thought about that morning at my desk, staring at $27 million and 4 words I couldn't yet understand. I thought about how easily I could have accepted the money and let 15 years of unanswered questions remain unanswered forever. I thought, too, about how close I'd come to choosing comfort over truth, and how grateful I was that fear hadn't won. What would you have done if a fortune landed in your account and a stranger said, "We need to meet urgently"? Walk away with the money, or ask what it was really paying for? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for listening.